So for us, the Stop Killer Robots campaign reflects a somewhat technocentric and techno-deterministic worldview where technological systems, when given too much autonomy, become destructive. In this paper, we do not want to decline the possibility of such a future, but we do want to turn the attention away from killer robots as actual entities and argue that it is necessary to unpack the fundamentals that constitute them in the first place. A point that must be made is that killer robots do not yet exist. However, military researchers such as Shane Reeves and William Johnson argue that these technologies are near-term reality and they will be developed despite the campaigns trying to ban them. Killer robots then are both a part of and produced by the contemporary historical imaginary. By historical imaginary, we loosely borrow from Thomas Elsasser's definition of such as an ideological construct emerging from the attempts to represent something. Our proposition is that the discussions of killer robots are not solely representations of particular systems, nor solely related to prior ideological constructs in our society, but rather that they produce both simultaneously. We use the specific framework of cultural techniques in contemporary German media theory to deconstruct what composes these imaginaries. Here we are referring to Thomas Macho's take on cultural techniques and his much referred notion that writing, reading, painting, counting, and making music are always older than the concepts that are generated from them. That was a quote. This then is our argument. The potential for killer robots exists. It exists as cultural techniques which can lead to the actualization of these systems. So what are cultural techniques? As Bernhard Siegert argues, cultural techniques is a framework that denotes a multi-layered approach with diverse conceptual history. The first uses of cultural techniques relate to rural engineering and the processes of turning the soil into the groundings of homesteads and cities. These processes that make the distinction between the soil and the groundings, such as drying swamps or drawing lines on the land, exist somewhere between nature and culture. According to Jeffrey Winthrop Young, they are neither cultural or natural in any ordinary sense, because they generate this distinction in the first place. According to Siegert, the analysis of cultural techniques observes and describes techniques involved in operationalizing distinctions in the real. To rephrase, the cultural techniques approach these distinctions as a constitutive force in our culture. Cultural techniques also involve particular skills, aptitudes, and abilities. The effectiveness of these skills, aptitudes, and abilities relate to the specific materiality of the objects under examination. In order to cultivate the soil, one needs to understand its structure. Or to give a more recent example, in order to code an application, one needs to use a specific programming language. From this perspective, a killer robot would be a construct of different kinds of materialities and cultural techniques involved in putting it together. In other words, cultural techniques presuppose technical objects that perform them. A corollary of this proposition is that the human, the one using cultural techniques, is also a product of these techniques and the non-human actors involved. So, what are the moral and ethical problems according to the Stop Killer Robot campaign, and how to unpack them with the cultural techniques approach? According to the campaign, the fundamental ethical and moral problem with killer robots is, do we allow life and death decisions to be made by robots? To be more precise, the campaign is actually less about making distinction between life and death and more about an ethical claim of what are considered acceptable decision-making techniques. We are interested in how these decision-making techniques are imagined and designed in the context of robot ethics and military discourses related to killer robots. In fact, from a cultural techniques perspective, these concepts, ideas, and notions, such as legal and ethical frameworks that exist on modern warfare, guide the ways in which killer robots are imagined and potentially built. In this context, cultural techniques of war do not question killing in general, but instead constitute particular practices of killing that determine their objects and subjects. So according to Ronald Arkin, the politics of modern warfare is based on two principles: jus in bello, which applies limitations to the conduct of warfare, and jus ad bellum, which restricts the condition required prior to entering into war. The legal rules of war, especially in jus in bello, become cultural techniques when they are taken as ethical principles and programmed as part of artificial morality. Building on the limitations to the conduct of warfare, Arkin argues that we can see three constitutive ethical principles or rules according to which killer robots should operate. Discrimination, proportionality, and responsibility. Discrimination means being able to differentiate military objectives and combatants from non-combatants and other structures of civil society. The principle of proportionality denotes that acts of war should not yield damage disproportionate to the ends that justify their use, and responsibility means that agents or actors must be held responsible for their actions in war. Programming these ethical guidelines is a moral problem and a technical problem. The robot needs to be designed to recognize a myriad of things and operate accordingly. On a very abstract level, and from the point of view of cultural techniques, making decisions is a problem of distinctions. Making distinctions is a way to make order into the world, and importantly, these processes of order making do not represent the existing world, but create that world in the process. The question then is, which cultural techniques provide the most efficient and perhaps ethical ways to make distinctions that base the decision between who is let to live and who is made to die? Which ethics, which technical solutions? According to Abney, in the context of robot ethics, this question has been answered in two pragmatic ways, with top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. Top-down approaches to artificial morality involve programming the robot to operate according to a fixed set of rules. According to Lin, one way to do this is to have a set of rules that can be turned into an algorithm. The algorithm then specifies the duties of a moral agent or the need for the agent to calculate the consequences of the various courses of action it might select. As Abney points out, the ontological or duty-based ethics correspond to top-down approaches. Here robots act in accord with some finite set of presumably algorithmic rules, and moral decision-making would thus consist simply in computing the proper outcome of the programmable rules. Let's say that the robot is designed to recognize military uniforms and determine someone as combatant based on those patterns. What if the person surrenders and thus becomes a non-combatant? The person is still wearing the uniform. This is actually Sparrow's example. This might be an oversimplification of the problem, but here the top-level approach generates problems because a rule-based ethical system is inflexible and unable to adapt to changes and make distinctions accordingly. In the context of robot ethics, this is called as the frame problem, which addresses the question of what and how much information is relevant or irrelevant for decision-making. In other words, where to draw the distinction. An alternative to rule-based systems is a system where decision-making is based on learning from sensor data and evaluation algorithms. These would be bottom-up approaches to artificial morality. Machine learning that mixes pattern recognition with computational learning is an example of cultural techniques used in bottom-up approaches. Machine learning can be used in designing predictive systems that can analyze information and learn from it. Robots based on machine learning can be designed to distinguish combatants from non-combatants through learning processes that can be improved, continued, refined through battlefield training. As such, they would become able to recognize context through data, be able to learn new conventions from the start, and make predictive analysis based on the information of similar situations and patterns that appear in these situations. While the bottom-up approach might solve the problem of fixed rules through learning and adaptation, there are, however, several challenges inherent in these approaches. One problem is that of sample selection. To put this bluntly, when autonomous, the killer robot may learn wrong. It does not necessarily follow any goals or aims set up initially by the human programmer. Here, the dystopias of the campaign would be realized. Especially in the case of the bottom-up approaches, what appears as a clear-cut decision drawn between who lives and who dies on the battlefield is in fact a multiple process of technologies and cultural techniques so complex that they disappear from the scope of human understanding. The killer robot or autonomous weapon system may be the subject that makes the decision, but the decision-making itself is guided by operations such as machine learning or rule-based algorithms that manipulate the killer robot to operate in particular ways. The decision of who lives and who dies does not happen on the battlefield, but it is an agglomerate of smaller distinctions made on a micro level, beginning from the idea that killer robots could exist and moving towards the choice of technologies and rule-based systems in their design. So when we are talking about killer robots, it evidently is very hard to overcome the binary relation between life and death. While the military context is the central space where these systems are currently being discussed, we have recently witnessed end-of-life robotics entering other regimes of the imaginaries of our techno-social culture. For example, last year, a spoof site called iflscience.org claimed that researchers in Japan were developing a very specific healthcare robot called Sepukuma, which you see in the slide. According to the story, Sepukuma was equipped with 23 very different methods one can choose to end their life. News about Sepukuma broke through different news outlets, and the idea of a killer robot that would provide euthanasia was welcomed with mixed responses. Well, while Sepukuma does not exist, and there are a number of ethical constraints limiting the design of euthanasia robots, one can quite easily see that the healthcare industry might be interested in robots dealing with palliative care. These systems can assist patients who cannot survive home alone and help them carrying on a living. To put this provocatively, on the battlefield we have killer robots, but in the field of healthcare we have robots that do not let die. Indeed, medical technologies have for a long time now drawn the distinction between life and death. As Goldberg argued in the 1990s, at least from a legal perspective, artificial respirators and other life support systems have substituted our understanding of death from the failure of the body to the permanent loss of consciousness. This is an important argument because it shows how cultural techniques along with technologies constantly redraw the distinctions we sometimes take as given, such as life and death. So to conclude, Michel Foucault in his lecture on biopolitics discusses the complex relation of the atom bomb and the power over human life. In the same text, Foucault points to a future where it becomes technologically and politically possible to build viruses that cannot be controlled and are universally destructive. This monster or living matter will be beyond all human sovereignty. This Foucauldian train of thought is carried on in the open letter, where the undersigned artificial intelligence and robotics researchers state that autonomous weapons have been described as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear arms, and starting a military AI arms race is a bad idea and should be prevented by a ban on offensive autonomous weapons beyond meaningful human control. These were quotes from the open letter. With this statement, and in general, the open letter does not judge the acts of killing in modern warfare, nor does it judge the development of military technologies. The problem regarding autonomous weapons in the open letter is the lack of human control these devices bring forth. Like viruses and biological weapons for Foucault, killer robots for the authors of the open letter do not threaten only life, but they also threaten human sovereignty as the locus of controlling the questions of who lives and who dies. The historical imaginaries around killer robots constitute what Stuart Hall has defined as moral panic. Moral panic emerges when reactions to something are out of proportions to the actual threat and become emphasized by authorities speaking at least apparently with one voice. The open letter against the development of killer robots could be used as an example to illustrate how moral panics may lead into particular political decision-making. What is more important, however, is the way these discussions can also obfuscate and render invisible the constitutive technical operations they arise from. Killer robots are easy targets for criticism because they are concrete even when they are imaginary objects. However, the criticism that takes these objects as its target moves the focus away from cultural techniques that can be found behind these systems. These techniques draw the distinctions between competent and non-competent, human and machine, life and death. The robot is merely a manifestation of these techniques. In other words, while it may be the robot that pulls the trigger, the actual operation of pulling is a consequence of vast chain of operations, processes, and calculations. Cultural techniques, such as machine learning, pattern recognition, predictive modeling, and all the other buzzwords of STEM are behind these operations. Being essentially computational, these tasks are by definition out of human control. No human can follow the computations occurring inside these systems, and no human can process as much data as computers. Speed matters, size matters. The Stop Killer Robots campaign finds its power in the logic of preemption. The campaign discusses a future with killer robots and makes an appeal towards actions and decisions in the present so that this future will not ever happen. What the campaign misses, however, is that these robots already exist. They exist as cultural techniques, that is, ideas, processes, devices, and modes of thinking that make them possible. But they also exist materially in different fields than military. Ryan Callow argues that in the United States alone, about 1 person per year is killed by an industrial robot. So how a robot becomes a killer is a question that demands to be answered when we enter into a culture where cars drive themselves, planes fly themselves, stocks are traded by robots, and healthcare is moved to smart homes. This question needs to be asked when we are faced with computational logic and automation of our environments. The technologies that on the battlefield of the future will make decisions between life and death, when taken apart by their techniques, are the same technologies that can be used in different fields of our everyday life. Thus, while killer robots are an obvious manifestation of historical imaginary of 21st century, where automation has the potential to become universally destructive for humanity, they are also products of particular cultural techniques, which, as Jussi Parikka notes, already participate in the formation of subjects, as well as constitute ways of knowing and organizing social reality. Thanks.